for example, when we talked to the neighborhood commission, who I had 2 weeks earlier presented the fact that we were serving all third graders in the school district, and he was like, well, this is all well and good that you're doing art, but there's not enough art in the schools. And I was like, yeah, we're serving all the third graders. And he's like, oh, okay, then now I'll listen to you. But she started out her slideshow saying people don't listen the way they used to, and it showed a bunch of people in suits looking at their iPhones, and then it made the entire commission put their phones down and listen to us. And we were very intentional about our language, dealing with all the different sensitivities of the community, with us as a platform, and also with her going around and having conversations with the different people in the community, this conflict resolution organization, all those types of things, before even deciding what kind of intervention to have. And so then this one, ultimately the only intervention was listening. And then we went to different groups and we were like, how do you want to listen? How do you want to be listened to? And so this neighborhood commission, who were like, we feel like we're supposed to be the voice of the community, but nobody's listening to us, and all this weight on them with the dissolution of the CRA. And then we worked with a group of teenage youth advocates that were actually part of a drug and alcohol prevention organization, but they do much more than that. And the youth advocates are really amazing. Whenever I'm doing a project that wants to engage teenagers, I go to one of their youth advocate meetings and I pitch it to them, and they tell me if I'm ridiculous or if I'm not, or if I need to change my language so that I can actually access them, because I'm not that cool anymore. And so it ended up, the Northwest Commission decided to have an official community meeting at our site and involve the teenage youth advocates and listen to each other. And so it was really amazing. And then we allowed the teenagers to decide how they wanted to be listened to. And so when you're doing these types of projects, if you really want the community to come up with their own solutions, you have to really step back and surrender some ownership and let them decide for this specific type of dialectical work, which, it's sort of pedagogical, but we try really hard to break down those hierarchies within our methodology. So they went around and they mapped the community. The red dots are things they want to see change, or areas for opportunity, and then the green dots were things that they liked. And then they presented them to the neighborhood commission. First they displayed them inside the round room sculptures, and they all talked about them, and then they presented them to the neighborhood commission, and it was an official, on the record, Robert's Rules of Order, city meeting, and it turned out that it was a whole lot of stuff that the neighborhood commission had also brought up, like broken streetlights and stuff, that was their job. They're supposed to send the list of broken streetlights to the city, and I remember sitting in on a meeting, and they were like, the broken streetlights, all the ones that we sent on last year's list are still broken, so we didn't even bother to map the new ones. But then when the teenagers come and do it, and the city manager showed up, and city council people showed up, and the police department showed up, and transportation, Department of Water and Power, they listened to the teenagers. And one of the kids lived in my neighborhood. I lived on the darkest block in Pasadena because we were right on the city line. There was no street light on my street, and I got a street light on my block because of this project. But yeah, and then this is another one of the different interactive things. And so this is just a really tangible example. That's my community outreach manager. And this is the son of one of the Northwest commissioners. And this was one of the listening workshops where you could make apparatuses to interact with the sculptures. And he connected himself with her. And then I brought them over to the big horns, and then I connected the horns to them, and got to observe this really beautiful, intimate moment. But in the process of doing this project, they decided to have us host a city council election forum. That was 2 years ago election. We have another election going on right now. And when I go to the forums that are representing our neighborhood, the language from this project still is language that gets maintained in the community about how they work with each other. And so it was just really amazing how this simple interaction of listening was able to have people develop all these sustainable solutions of how they were going to solve their own problems. And I feel like that's one of the ways to address the issue of gentrification and artist projects, is that if you go and you say, I'm going to do this resource at you, or, this is what you need, it doesn't it's not sustainable. But when you go in and you're like, let's all have a conversation about these issues, and then the community is like, oh, well, we could do this, and like you have that resource and you have that resources. Let's work together and do this. So now, like, the youth advocates, I think, have a seat on a youth seat on the Northwest Commission and things like that. And so that's my spiel.
In grant writing for something like this, it's a little atypical, and you're trying to convince your grantee that you don't know what the project is going to look like, or that it's open-ended, but that it's provoking dialogue. And how do you think that's a challenge, and how do you think
it's a challenge every day of my life? I'm actually working on, hopefully, knock on wood, I just pitched a book to a foundation that's sort of the pragmatic end of artists working in communities, and it's going to address everything from like the fundraising, the communication models of how you communicate that type of thing, because also a lot of them are cumulative, and like the business model. So like depending on what your project is, like you may want to go through a nonprofit model, or you may want to go through, like that, the Love Apples project. If we did the guerrilla gardening, we would have gotten in trouble as a nonprofit. But if they had had the kids doing the guerrilla gardening in the middle of the street, they would have gotten in trouble. So we had the kids doing it in our safe lot, and then they were doing the guerrilla gardening separate from us. And so there's like all different elements that, yeah, it's a challenge, but there are more and more foundations that are catching on to this type of thing. And if you hit me up later, I can talk to you in more detail.
I'm teaching right now, and I also do dialogue-based projects, but I really wonder about how you actually teach the skill set of not just talking and listening, but also you obviously have really good negotiating skills, and I wonder what you think of as the education that you got to have those skills and how you pass them on.
One of my dearest friends is a Harvard MBA professional negotiator. And I keep her in my back pocket, although in many cases, like right now I'm doing this huge negotiation with the city of Pasadena with the giant National Endowment for the Arts Art Town grant that I can't speak publicly about how frustrating it is, but her sometimes that business person is too cutthroat. But part of it is, as I wrote down the anthropological theory that you guys were using, but borrowing from practices of sociology, anthropology, business, and community organizers. Like Tom Finkelpearl, he sends a community organizer in before the artist. I'm interested in teaching artists how to be the community organizer.
You talked a lot about both sides of the coin, but I'm really interested in you elaborating a little bit on is that transition from this playful dialogue and engagement into the more constructive. Like you talked about doing these projects and this wonderful little action, and then you're talking about the other side of the coin and being in front of an audience and pitching to funders and stuff like that. Talk a little bit about the transition of how perhaps these playful engagements catalyze or provoke those more constructive conversations.
Yeah, so, I mean, this particular project was very multi-layered. And so, and if we had done it all, like, if it was just all community meetings, it would almost feel like, I mean, I feel like there's a balance between, particularly when you're doing work in an under-resourced community, there's an important balance between using the community to accomplish your project and doing things that really are beneficial to the community and allowing them to have ownership over that. And so if it was all really serious and heavy, they wouldn't have been engaged. And so by having multiple layers of how to engage them, so like that little kid, Noel's kid, was not gonna be part of the community meeting, but he learned a lot about listening through the Saturday classes. And so I think it comes back to how, like, developing the language, but also just how to engage the different stakeholders in a really holistic perspective. Does that make sense?
A little bit. Like you said, he was talking, and then later on you talked about, well, now there's like what a member of the kids council on the community board or something like that, and that a really important part of the process is that step, is that conversion from the playful engagement to the constructive engagement.
Well, Noel, his dad, would not be, I can't remember the kid's name, his dad would not be so bought into the project if his child was not engaged in the way that his child was engaged. This workshop was directed at kids. And then the community meeting was directed at adults, and like we had some activity somewhere that the kids could do so that they weren't fidgety during the community meeting. But by having those multiple layers, and that's also, an opportunity for creative output. I mean, we also had another, on art night where they have the free buses going around, we had percussionists using Morse code to play the satellite dishes and, like super playful stuff. But then, the meat of it was like, nobody's listening to us, and what came out of it was like, if the teenagers say it, all of a sudden the city manager listens. But if we had just done that part, it wouldn't have been art. It would have been community organizing.
Yeah, I'm interested in your organizational structure, like, how many people do you have on staff operating these, because these are large activities, and to be able to, like, do both the, like, creative, playful, artistic child, work, and then also have an effective policy strategy that's a lot, girl, so I'm like, how many people do you have working for you and with you, and how do you sort of mitigate between, the people who are paid staff and the people who are, community members who are volunteers, and like, I know that I'm sort of thinking through a lot of these ideas myself, and sort of struggling with this idea of like, okay, like how do you justify it to like not just like, everyone you're working with, as far as like, okay, here are the staff positions, and here are like, we need volunteers to do all this work, but also just justify it to myself and decide whether it's, if that balances.
I run the organization like a business.
Mm-hmm.
We have a really interesting staffing structure. I have 15 employees. I have one full-time employee other than myself. And then I have 3 3/4-time employees. And so when we're presenting, because they're professional artists and they don't want a full-time job, when we're presenting these projects, we're not just presenting the artists, we're also training them, and so they get a set amount of staff hours. I have the community outreach manager, which is blue right there. I have a communications manager, and I have a site manager who helps with fabrication. And the communications manager helps them with messaging, talking to press. So depending on the skill set of the artist, they get a set amount of staff support from those different people. So like Blue is the liaison to the community, and in this particular case, because we were dealing with some serious heavy hitters, I was the liaison to the community. But then the other way that we sustain the organization is that woodworking bus, half the kids get it for free and half the kids pay for it. And my 3/4-time staff members, I could get really like nitty gritty, and again, like I'm here all weekend, so we should talk about it. My 3/4-time staff people have a set amount of hours that are admin time, that are their communication, site, or community outreach, and then they also are teaching artists. And so if funding is bad, like if we have a bad funding year, which like this year is kind of a rough funding year, we'll hire the program out more. They get more priority for teaching time. And then if it's a good funding year, they can spend more time admin, and we can give the program away for free. But it helps us get through those like 2008s. And then there's like other super accounting nerdy stuff that I do that keep us sustainable. Depreciation.
So, I'm from St. Louis, and I work with a social worker, and you use the word intervention quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered about that because that's something that comes out of the social work field, but the artists that I know in social practice in St. Louis gag at that word. So could you talk about that a little bit?
And honestly, I get stuck. I mean, I just did like the aesthetics and politics program at CalArts, and so this is kind of based on my thesis. But I actually originally said interrogation instead of exploration, and even the word exploration is too colonial. But the artists aren't making the intervention, it's the community that's making the intervention. But it's, sometimes when I get caught up in semantics, like I lose my message, and so sometimes I just kind of say screw it and throw it out the window and use the word that I feel like gets the point across. But what, do you have a better word? Because I'd love to hear it.
We just avoid that word.
Well,
because it sounds like you're pushing something onto a community. So it's more about, like, I love your mobile trailer. I think going into the liquor store, brilliant. You know, that's kind of where we're at. Working beside people in the community, taking your skills as an artist, hearing what they're trying to do, and kind of being invited. Being invited is big, because St. Louis is, you know, we're in a tough spot.
Yeah, no, and honestly, like, and in this, like, particularly with the listening project, and I am using the word intervention, but the only intervention is listening. Like, even one of the commissioners was like, well, are you guys using us for some crazy art thing? Like, what's going to really happen here? And we're like, no, we just want to listen to you. And it just sort of blows their mind. I also use the term complex public negotiation in these types of situations where I feel like me as an artist, because I don't really make things anymore, that when I'm able to change the perspective of a bureaucrat, that I'm being successful as an artist. But yeah, it's if I said that we were making positive change, I would be wrong, because it's not positive for everybody. Yeah. And so that's why, you know, it's like the artist is intervening in some way or another by being present. And, you know, and it's just like saying, like, we can't say it's non-hierarchical pedagogy because pedagogy is inherently hierarchical. But we're trying to look at things from that perspective of not the bank deposit model, but the, you know, having, you know, ignorant professor, ignorant schoolmaster, or whatever, you know, having a conversation. But maybe it comes from the fact that my mom's a social worker.
Maybe conversation. That could be, yeah. There you go.